welcome to this session in the York Festival of Ideas. My name is Dr. Louise Hampson and I'm part of the History Department here at York, currently working on a project Henry on Tour on the progresses of Henry VIII. So it's my very great pleasure now to introduce our speaker this evening. Peter K Andersson is a senior lecturer in history in Sweden. He is the author of Street Life in Late Victorian London and Silent History. But tonight he'll be talking to us about his latest book, Fool, in Search of Henry VIII's Closest Man. Peter, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me, and thank you all for coming. And I thought we'd start this talk with a joke. And in order to spare you the trouble of trying to come up with a 16th century joke, I have done that work for you. And I will begin this talk then by quoting a joke that was attributed to one of the most famous comedians of the Tudor era, namely Henry VIII's court fool, William Summer. And whether or not you still think it passes as a joke once I have quoted it, I am not quite certain. It is said that Summer once commended a bishop that he knew of, saying that this bishop had a good bass voice, and that he had at one time made the most bass sermon that Summer had ever heard in his life. Yes, well, it's never an easy job retelling a joke, and retelling it 500 years later is hardly easier. But can this be qualified as a joke? It is quoted in a contemporary book as an amusing remark. But part of the comedy lies, of course, in the fact that the teller of the joke is unaware of the humor. It should thus be categorized as a gaffe, a slip-up. Nevertheless, I would claim that it is quite representative, both as a 16th century joke and as a saying attributed to a Renaissance fool. But in order to understand why, it is necessary that we look more closely at the man to whom it is attributed and try to figure out what manner of man it was. If anyone encounters Will Summer these days, they probably encounter him on a visit to this place, Hampton Court Palace. In the Long Gallery, there hangs a painting entitled The Family of Henry VIII, painted around 1545 by an unknown artist. At first sight, this painting is what its title says, group portrait of the king's family, albeit anachronistic, since Jane Seymour, who is standing next to the king, had been dead for some years when the painting was made, dying due to complications arising after the birth of Edward, who is here depicted as at least 7 or 8 years old. But it is to the two figures on each end of the panel that I want to draw your attention. These two are standing in a garden beyond the throne room, where the family is posing. They have been identified as, on the right, William Summer, the king's fool, and on the left, the woman we know only as Jane Fool, who was the Queen's fool. While unfortunately very little information on Jane can be obtained, we know a bit more about Summer. Not a whole lot, but enough for me to be able to conjure up a book about him. The inclusion of the fools in such an intimate family portrait surely says something about the role and importance of fools in the royal household. Summer is seen apparently making a bow, possibly directed at Jane, who he might be turned towards, standing in the same space. His courteous gesture towards a woman who barely seems aware of his presence seems intended to indicate his role, as of course is the monkey perched on his shoulder, which might be purely symbolic. There is no other record of him taking care of a monkey. Is this the man, then, who confused the two meanings of the word base when talking about a bishop? In the late 16th and early 17th century, when William Summer had died, his name was a household word. To the contemporaries of Shakespeare, Summer was a legendary comedian, one of England's finest wits, and his name was invoked at the beginning of humorous writings as one of a roster of legendary comics of English history, in the same way as Greek gods were invoked in the beginning of the epics of Homer. There was the semi-mythological Scoggin, fool to King Edward IV. There was Richard Tarleton, the first of the Elizabethan stage clowns, often thought to be the model of Yorick in Hamlet, and there were all the other comic actors in Shakespeare's time: John Lanham, John Singer, Will Kemp, Thomas Pope. Names like these were frequently mentioned in Elizabethan literature as comedy greats, invariably men whose wit was seen as groundbreaking and renowned. But these are strange lists where some names are fictional or mythological, whereas the reputation of others rests almost purely on posthumous anecdotes. Naturally, Henry VIII's witty and clever fool needed to be part of this pantheon, and there was no end to the retellings of his escapades, especially in the very popular theatrical genre of plays about the reign of Henry VIII. Will Sommer is most famously a witty fool character in Samuel Rowley's play When You See Me, You Know Me, and Thomas Nash's only play Summer's Last Will and Testament. Notably, Shakespeare does not include him as a character in his and John Fletcher's play about Henry VIII, but the prologue in that play remarks that those who have come expecting to see a merry boy play and a fellow in a long motley coat will be deceived. So the absence of such an expected and beloved character as Henry VIII's fool from a play about Henry VIII had to be commented upon and in some way explained away. The posthumous literature about Sommer reaches its pinnacle in two works with biographical claims. Not very famous is the 1637 book, A Pleasant History of the Life and Death of Will Sommers, which is little more than a collection of standard jests, some of which have been attributed to other famous comics in other jest books. Here, Will Sommer has finally been turned into a stereotypical court jester. And when we look at the similarity of King Henry in the book's illustrations with contemporary portraits, we get some idea of the similarity of Will Sommer in this book to the real Will Sommer. More famous is Robert Armin's book, Fool Upon Fool, first published in 1600, later reissued under the admittedly much better title, A Nest of Ninnies. This is a collective biography of 6 famous fools that Armin either knew of or had met, and this work is often connected to Armin's development of the fool character in Shakespeare's later plays. Armin worked as the clown at the Globe Theatre and is believed to have been the first to portray roles such as Touchstone, Feste, and King Lear's fool. His interest in historical fools is thought to have been put into his characterizations. It's interesting, however, to note that whereas the Shakespearean fools Armin played are often seen as moving towards the clever truth-teller stereotype of the court fool that we often think of today, the fools that he wrote about in his book were not this type of clever, witty fool, quite the opposite. At this point, it is worth mentioning that the Renaissance notion of fools and folly was characterized by what was seen as a division between natural and artificial fools. Natural fools were what we today would call people with some form of intellectual disability, and this constituted probably the largest portion of the men and women who were engaged as court and household fools during the early modern period. Artificial fools were fools who feigned folly, but were in reality skilled in improvising rhyme and making wry comments. This is the type of fool that perhaps most appears in modern fiction, but in this age there was a suspicion of artificial folly because it was thought that artificial fools might deceive their masters. In Armin's book, all of the fools he writes about are natural fools. All of them are extremely interesting in their own right, and we don't have time to go into all of them here, but let's just say that they give us quite a different picture of the court fool than the one we get from, say, Wamba in Ivanhoe or Danny Kaye in The Court Jester. The fools in Armin's book get into fights and brawls. They are violent and abusive. One of them devours a live bird. The keeping of fools like these would be like keeping a wild lion as a pet. The interesting thing is that it is all seen as a form of entertainment or diversion. The chaos and turmoil of early modern streets continued inside the castle walls. In this assembly of unruly fools, Will Sommer comes across as relatively harmless. When Armin wrote his book, Summer had been dead for nearly 40 years, so many of the anecdotes about him have the form of standardized tales rather than snapshots from his actual life. Nevertheless, Armin's passion for the subject matter shines through, and it is clear that he also endeavors to find out some real facts about his fool. Thus, we get in his book the only credible information on where Summer might have come from. He writes that he was born in Shropshire, as some say. We also get an intriguing piece of information about one of Summer's curious character traits, a trait that is corroborated by contemporary accounts, namely that he had a tendency to fall asleep in odd places. Lastly, Armin, in passing, makes a strange remark that, thanks to its unassuming nature, sounds believable, which only makes it even stranger. He says that after an evening of entertaining the king, Summer would go into a corner of the room to sleep with the spaniels. I have not found any other reference to this, but as we shall see, the image of a man who sleeps in the dog basket somehow fits into the role and treatment of time. So, in Armin's account, we get some brief glimpses of a real fool rather than the archetypal witty fool that Summer turned into in Elizabethan drama. But in order to really get to know him, we of course need to go to more contemporary records. We know that Summer died in 1560, shortly after attending the coronation of Elizabeth, but we don't know when he was born. He first appears in records of the royal court in the 1530s, and most references to him occur in the account books of the royal wardrobe. This is common for most Renaissance fools. There are barely any records of what they said or did or what types of people they were, but there is a wealth of information on what they wore. Clothes and fabrics for clothes are being ordered for Summer throughout his life. There are particularly numerous entries during the reign of Queen Mary. And in some cases, we can square the information on Summer's clothes with the other main source we have on him, portraits. Because the appearance of Will Summer is actually more well documented than that of many aristocrats of this period. The family portrait that I began with is one of the earliest depictions of him. Here he is seen dressed in the livery of the Tudor court. An even earlier portrait is found in an illumination in Henry VIII's Psalter, dated to around 1540. The image is meant to illustrate the line in the 14th Psalm, "The fool hath said in his heart, there is no God." Henry is here playing the role of King David, and Summer is seen wearing the green hooded coat that is ordered for him, the first references to him in the Order of Accounts in 1535. He is wearing virtually the same clothes in a later portrait, where he is seen standing behind Henry and his daughter Mary. This is probably painted during the reign of Mary and intended to accentuate the connections with the court of Henry, which evidently could be summed up in the figure of the king and his fool. The man we see in these portraits does not come across as a typical fool, at least not if we expect to see a man in motley with bells or donkey ears on his cap. If we want to, we might see a vague reference to the man's position in the bells on the dog's collar here. But in this painting especially, Summer peers out at us with a knowing smile, looking with his chiseled features more like a mixture of Gordon Ramsay and Stephen Burkoff than someone who is meant to be silly or foolish. But the written record tells a different story. It is time to go back to that joke I began with. The one with the bishop with a bass voice who gave a bass sermon. It is, of course, possible to interpret this as a deliberately foolish remark designed to make the person saying it appear stupid. But it can also be interpreted as an actual gaffe, a foolish remark that is unintentionally funny. It relates to that fundamental Renaissance division of folly, natural or artificial. It is undoubtedly in records like these, rather than in accounts or portraits, that we come close to Will Summer and might speculate about what sort of a man he was and how he was treated. Contemporary references to him can be divided into two categories: references to something he has said by someone who was present or was told about it, and references to his conduct and mannerisms. Summer's utterances and sayings were quoted by many of the most prominent writers and courtiers of the day. Most of them are of roughly the same nature, of which the bishop comment is the most concise version. Summer has said something that is stupid and becomes unintentionally funny. But the true nature of these sayings and whether or not they truly are unintentionally funny is often unclear. The scholar and administrator Thomas Wilson makes perhaps the most famous reference to a joke by Will Summer in his book, The Art of Rhetoric, in 1553. Here he uses something that Summer has said in order to illustrate a point he makes on the topic of altering a word to give it a new meaning. Altering part of a word is when we take a letter or syllable from some word, or else add a letter or syllable to a word. As thus, William Summer, seeing much ado for accounts making, and that the King's Majesty of most worthy memory, Henry VIII, wanted money, such as was due unto him. And please your grace, quoth he, you have so many frauditors, so many conveyors, and so many deceivers to get up your money, that they get all to themselves. Whether he said true or no, let God judge that. It was unhappily spoken of, and I think he had some schoolmaster. He should have said auditors, surveyors, and receivers. So Wilson sort of kills the joke by explaining it, but his reservations might also be indicative of how we should interpret it. Most historians who have quoted this passage sees it as just a joke made by a court fool, and thus as proof of the fact that Will Summer was a wry and acidic commentator of his times. Further proof of his wit is the way he cleverly hides his criticism in a seemingly foolish remark. Because it is hardly likely that someone would mispronounce 3 words in such a way that they gain a new meaning, isn't it? Then again, a lot of other references to Summer's utterances suggest that he had a famous propensity for putting his foot in his mouth. Perhaps what he said was not quite as suitable as this, but something that could be easily brushed up to acquire a more sophisticated comic dimension. But then there is the matter of Wilson's comments. His first reservations, amounting to whether he spoke truly or not, is not for me to say. That's straightforward enough, and it indicates that Wilson wishes to dissociate himself from the biting remark in order to avoid blame. He underlies his stance by condemning the fool's words. Unhappily, in this context, should probably be read in the sense of mischievously or maliciously, a meaning that was commonly ascribed to this word in the 16th century. But it is what he says thereafter that is the most interesting. I think he had some schoolmaster. This can be read in various ways. The most natural interpretation for a modern reader might be that Wilson is saying Summer was not that uneducated. But more likely, Wilson is suggesting that Summer was coached or schooled by someone to say what he did. The image of a fool who is given words to say by others so that he will take the blame rhymes quite well with how Summer and fools generally were treated in the Renaissance. In the book, I go into more detail about what Summer was quoted as saying in different contexts and how this fitted into the atmosphere and male fraternity of the Tudor court. But what makes it difficult to view Summer as a witty, licensed fool in the way the posthumous mythology portrayed him are the many contemporary records of the handling he was subjected to by others. A famous literary allusion to Will Summer appears in the prominent Tudor poet John Heywood's dialogue, Witty and Witless, that dates from the 1530s. In this dialogue, 2 characters debate whether it is better to be a wise man or to be a fool, each of the men taking the opposite stance. In his effort to prove that wise men are better off than witless men, one of the disputants tries to illustrate how hard the life of the fool is by listing all the abuses he is subjected to. Some beat him, some bob him, some joll him, some job him, some tug him by the arse, some lug him by the ears, some spit at him, some spurn him, some toss him, some turn him, some snap him, some snatch him, some cramp him, some cratch him, some cuff, some clout him, some lash him, some lout him, some whisk him, some whip him, with sharp nails some nip him. Not even Master Summer, the king's greatest fool, but tasteth sometimes at the lips of new school. So to be an ordinary fool can hardly have been a picnic when not even the king's own fool, Master Summer, can escape chastisement from time to time. The fact that fools were beaten and chastised in the same way as children is well documented. and it corresponds to the contemporary notions of folly and how best to moderate it. But the harsh treatment of fools does not stop at mere retribution for bad behavior. In Summer's case, there are records of him being manhandled when on horseback so that he fell from the saddle, that he was taunted into bouts of rage and pitted against other fools, resulting in violent clashes. It is all examples of a type of rowdy, masculine socializing that was common at European courts, at least if we are to believe Baldassare Castiglione in his famous Book of the Courtier, in which he tries to do away with such rowdy behavior among courtiers as pushing each other downstairs, causing each other's horses to roll over, or throwing soup and gravy in people's faces at dinner. This is not proper conduct for a civilized courtier, Castiglione claims, and he puts into the same category the habit of joking and fraternizing with fools. The difference between fools and other courtiers was, of course, that the fools were at the very bottom of the hierarchy. Any man who has experienced the rough horseplay that often goes on in groups of young men know that bullying is always just around the corner, and the fool was the obvious bully victim. The life and role of the court fool was precarious, disorderly, and characterized by low status or no status. But all these aspects of the court fool's life arouse a potent question. Was Will Summer a typical Renaissance fool or an unusual one? This allows us to widen our gaze and look at fools across Renaissance Europe to see what sort of people they were and what their role at court was. And one thing is definitely clear. There was hardly a royal court or aristocratic household in Europe from the late Middle Ages until the late 17th century that did not employ some form of fool. The kings of Spain, France, and the Italian states had numerous, and they proliferated down the social scale of the event. Thomas More had a household fool. The famous astronomer Tycho Brahe had a dwarf who used to sit under the table at dinner. These fools are often very well documented in the same way as Will Summer is, through portraiture and records in court account books, usually in reference to their clothes. Beyond this, however, it is the same with almost all early modern fools. They have left behind no record of their thoughts, their lives, or their true personalities. In the rare cases where we have a diary or a letter that claims to have been written by a fool, the fool in question was definitely not a natural fool and seems to have had the status of a court official or administrator. As recently found by art historian Sarah McBride, Cosimo de' Medici of Florence employed 2 court dwarfs, but each had a very different role from the other. Morgante was equivalent to a fool and engaged in mock combats with monkeys, not seldom naked. The other dwarf, Pietro Barbino, was a literate and schooled man and gained the role of a court administrator. Consequently, the role of the fool or dwarf was dependent on his or her personality. If we look at some of these portraits, we see quite clearly that they would today have been diagnosed with some form of named intellectual disability, while others can hardly be set apart from other types of courtiers. But even among those fools who were more akin to Summer's category, the type of conduct and humor they exhibited could vary quite widely. I will give you some examples from my favorite European court fools. This is the very unusual and intimate portrait of the fool of the Duke of Ferrara in the 14th century, a man called Gonella. The name Gonella was a generic fool name in Ferrara that was given to a long succession of fools. So there was Gonella I, Gonella II, and so on, presumably because the original Gonella had been so popular. This is a portrait of Gonella II, and thankfully, unlike most other fools of this age, we also have a record of his doings. This is all thanks to the famous Italian writer Matteo Bandello, somewhat less well known than his contemporary Boccaccio, but just as prolific in the writing of comic short stories. And in some of these stories, Bandello talks about Gonella. They date from a few decades after the death of the fool, but Bandello claims that the stories are truthful, and it is very likely that Gonella's antics were talked about long after his demise. Gonella comes across in these stories as a skilled and calculating practical joker, but perhaps not of a kind that would become very well liked today. In one story, Gonella seeks to avenge a court physician that he does not like And one night, when the doctor is asleep, the fool puts his plan into action, in the words of Bandello. Gonella had been given 5 harmless laxative pills by a pharmacist. He took all 5 pills one evening, and around midnight they began to set his stomach in motion. When he saw that the doctor was sleeping on his back and snoring with his mouth open, he quietly got up and put his bottom over the doctor's face, and with a loud fart he emptied the whole storm over him, a great deal of which ended up in his mouth. The poor doctor, who was completely covered in shit, woke up, and when he started to scream, he swallowed several ounces, causing him to snort so that the Marquis woke up. When the Marquis felt the stench and heard the doctor complain, he said, "What the hell are you doing? Who has been shitting?" Gonella, getting out of bed, promptly declared the doctor to be full of shit, whereupon the doctor and the sheets were carried away by some servants. "Gonella, Gonella," said the Marquis, "now you have played another trick, but it really smells too bad." And then he went back to sleep. With some court fools, then, it seems that no one was safe, and the ducal palace could be turned into a carnivalesque arena for grotesque comedy at any moment. And grotesque in the true Bactinian sense of the word, as the introduction of bodily fluids and fecal matter into ordinary life. Fools like Gonella appear to have been given a carte blanche to trick people whenever they liked, running around much like disobedient children, always preparing a new prank. But in other cases, the tables were turned. Pope Leo X, ruler of the Papal States in the early 16th century, had a particular fondness for fools. It was said that the need for rowdy entertainment had to do with the lack of ladies at his court, but Leo's court was also a prosperous environment for poetry and music. Among Leo's most cherished possessions was Hanno the elephant, given to the Pope as a present at his coronation from the King of Portugal. When Hanno was presented to the Pope in a ceremonial procession through Rome, one of Leo's fools, Giacomo Baraballo, stood close to the Pope, shouting bad verses and obscenities in commentary of the elephant's progression. Leo seems to have been alternately amused and annoyed by this man, who had once been an abbot, but appears to have grown slowly mad. In retribution for Baraballo's public spectacle, Leo devised a plan to get even. Baraballo thought himself the greatest poet that had ever lived, and styled himself arch-poet of Rome. In mockery of his pomposity, Leo announced that he would crown Baraballo as arch-poet at an elaborate ceremony, in which he would be given the opportunity to declaim his verses on a public stage before riding in triumph through the city on Hanno. The event began to the great appreciation of Baraballo. He recited his preposterous verses, which everyone laughed at, but prominent poets also recited verses that mockingly praised Baraballo, which only served to heighten his self-importance. A cardinal crowned him and provided him with a large laurel branch, and then he paraded out to the elephant. With some difficulty, the 60-year-old overweight man managed to hoist himself up into the saddle, and Hanno began to move, leading a large procession from the Vatican towards the city of Rome. The noise of music and the crowds who laughed at seeing Baraballo started to unsettle the elephant, however, and he became increasingly stressed. When the procession had reached the Tiber and was about to cross the bridge into the city, Hanno panicked and started shaking his body so that the elaborate saddle where Baraballo sat precariously was thrown to the ground. Baraballo seems to have escaped unharmed, but the embarrassment of the situation made him quickly disappear into the crowds, and the festivities were promptly ended. So these two anecdotes about two different Italian court fools illustrate the variety both of the character of fools and what they did, and the variety of the relationship between fool and master. In other words, it is difficult to generalize about the Renaissance culture of court fools because it varied from country to country and depending on the nature of the individual fool. But there are, of course, certain recurring features, some of which Will Summer illustrates. If we compare Summer to these two Italian fools, we see on the one hand that the practical joking of Gonella was something limited to a very specific type of fool. You very seldom find tales of such shenanigans. Will Summer was definitely not a practical joker. Quite often, however, fools are portrayed as such in posthumous mythology of the type one finds in jest books of this period. The mockery and torment that Barabella was subjected to, however, is something that is very much recurrent among records of fools. We have seen how Summer became the victim of such bullying, and not even the mischievous Gonella could escape it. The most famous story about him concerns when one of his pranks awakened the rage of the Duke, and he had him sentenced to death. It was only a joke, and the Duke never intended to execute him, but on the day of the mock execution, Gonella was so terrified that he died of fright. Another interesting aspect about the treatment of fools is the strange combination of compassion and victimization that it exhibits. When they were not subjected to physical punishment or elaborate schemes to mock them, they seem to have been viewed and treated with the most loving care and consideration. Letters from Tudor courtiers express their heartfelt concern of the well-being of the beloved Will Summer. This also brings us back to one of Summer's qualities that Robert Armin mentioned, his sleepiness. Armin tells a story of how Summer once fell asleep on a gate, and when the courtiers noticed him, they went and fetched a pillow to put under his head to make him more comfortable. Other contemporary sources make reference to Summer's sleepiness. It is a point that Hilary Mantel took up when she made a brief reference to Summer in her Cromwell trilogy. And here, of course, she draws the logical conclusion that he suffered from what we today would call narcolepsy. Through small fragments of information, often provided in passing to contemporary sources, one can slowly piece together the image of the man behind the name of Summer. He can illustrate general points about the culture of fools, but the exercise of writing a book about him is essentially about something else. It activates the pursuit of history and the study of the past as an existential endeavor, an exercise. Writing this book has forced me to make a lot of conjecture and speculation, and critics like to ask the question, what is the point in writing a biography about someone of whom almost nothing can be known? But that is precisely the point. One of the most important tasks of the historian or the biographer is to shed light on the unknown, anonymous people of the past. There will perhaps always be a need for one more biography on Hitler or Henry VIII, but in spite of the dearth of information, I would argue that we learn just as much, if not more, from a biography of a man like Will Summer. So, to conclude, there are three main aspects to the culture of the Renaissance fool that Summer illustrates particularly well. The first is the notion that fools might be considered human pets, a concept elaborated upon by scholar Yifu Tuan. Due to their neurodiversity or mental state, they were at this point in history not considered equal to other humans, but they also had traits that inspired sympathy, and there was seldom any doubt that they needed care. But brutality and discipline were also part of this, and it was not considered wrong to laugh at them. And the second point that I want to mention here at the end turns us quite fittingly to that joke about the bishop's voice that I began with. It has been suggested that the social life of courts in the Renaissance period, and the culture of fools especially, had a special appreciation for what one might call involuntary bon mots. In other words, utterances that could be quoted as clever or witty sayings, but were not quite intended as such. And this, I think, is very much what the appeal of fools was about. And it was especially so in the case of Will Summer. Numerous references to his gaffes and even to his own awareness he was prone to put his foot in his mouth indicate that he was a virtually bold man who wanted to sprinkle amusing remarks, unintentionally wry comments into their conversation correspondence. There is a concise description of this side to Summer's character in a brief posthumous reference to an anonymous pamphlet. It says that there are there are some that speak as if their words were made of wild hops. Such men's tongues run always posting before, and their wits come halting after. Such a wit had William Summers. And this also gets at the heart. This gets at the third basic aspect of the culture of fools that I want to mention, namely the search for authenticity. There is in this time a longing for the natural and disaffected behavior that fools were thought to display. becomes particularly imperative in a court society permeated by performativity and strict codes of conduct. And this search is, of course, something that we can relate to today. It can be expressed in different ways, either in a quest for natural and genuine expressions in the arts. The continuous appeal of folk art or outsider art is a case in point. But perhaps more than this, the search for authenticity today is expressed in ways that are quite similar to the Renaissance culture of fools, namely in laughing at and mocking the accidentally comic or the involuntary bon mots of our own age. The difference is, though, that the victims of our mockery sometimes have a different position. Fools. Thank you.
Well, I think on that note, it remains for me to say a huge thank you to Peter, not least for putting up with the technical issues that we seem to have experienced, but also for an absolutely fascinating take on a very marginal and sort of shadowy character in many ways. And certainly, I'm sure I speak for many when I say it's really opened my eyes to a whole new aspect to a figure who was both in the court but not of the court. Just as a reminder, before we thank Peter, as you clap at home, unfortunately Peter can't see it, but I'm sure he'll be pleased to know you are, that a recording of this event will be available on the Festival of York Ideas YouTube channel, which you can access via the Watch Again section of the festival. And you will get an email telling you when that video is available to view. And if you'd like to purchase a copy of Peter's book, which I can heartily recommend, Fool in Search of Henry VIII's Closest Man, you can get it from our partner bookseller on the Festival Ideas, which is Fox Lane Books, foxlanebooks.co.uk, which I think has been put into the chat if you want to copy that. So thank you again so much, Peter, for such an interesting talk and really starting our festival off with a really interesting characterization of a
thank you for having me, and thank you all for coming, and thank you for your very interesting questions.